to talk to you today about something that I don't really think you know, but will really transform your life once you do. And it seems kind of funny to me because we never really learned this in school, and yet it should have been something we learned from the very beginning. Do you believe in universal laws? I'm assuming that you do. Everyone is governed by gravity, the speed of sound, the speed of light. No one wakes up one day and says, you know what, I'm not doing gravity today. That's for the rest of the planet. Now, we're going to do gravity whether we like it or not, whether we understand the consequences or not. And it's obviously to our advantage to understand them. But let me ask you this question. If I asked you what the 6 universal laws of the mind are plus 1, do you think you could answer that question without having to Google it? My guess is no. You probably can't answer the question. So I'm going to teach those to you today because they're really simple, but they are so important. It's how each and every one of us creates reality. Stephen Covey said it in his book, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. Gabrielle Bernstein wrote about it in her book, The Universe Has Your Back. She says, we see the world that we have made, but we don't see ourselves as the image maker. And remember, reality isn't what our eyes show our minds to see. It's what our mind tells our eyes what to see. That's how reality is created. And it's created around these 6 universal laws. And just to remind you, a universal law applies to everyone regardless. So the first law of the mind is that thoughts are real forces. I almost feel like I'm preaching to the choir when I explain this law, but it's so important. If you expose yourself to nothing but negative thinking and negative thoughts, you're going to carry that in your body. You're going to manifest that in a very poor posture. You're going to be not very energetic. Thoughts are real forces, and that's how you become lethargic in your life. You think that you can't do things. And I always like to remind you, remember what Henry Ford says, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. The second law of the mind is referred to as the law of transmission. It just means that our mind is a processing station for thoughts. We process 30 to 60,000 thoughts a day. We receive them, we hear them, we process our own thoughts, we process thoughts of other people. And of those 30 to 60,000, science has told us that 70 to 80% of them are negative, and many of those negative thoughts are self-taught. Self-talk about negative things against ourselves. So that's really important to know too. The third law of the mind is one most people have heard of, but maybe not necessarily in this context. It's called the law of attraction. And thoughts that become emotionalized become magnetized and then draw in more of the same types of thoughts. To understand this in a really simple form, think about the last time you went from anger to rage. It started off because you got upset about something. Something happened to you. And then you started thinking about everything else that was happening to you that wasn't very good either. And then all of a sudden you went from anger to rage. And maybe you even acted out on it, which basically takes us back to the first law, that thoughts are real forces. The fourth law is the law of control. And while we are always constantly thinking thoughts, our mind really never turns off. You have 2 options with every thought that goes through your mind. You can either entertain the thought, which again, you run the risk of emotionalizing it, magnetizing it, and multiplying it, and that's okay if that thought is in service and favor to you. Or the second option that you can do with every thought is dismiss it. And that's what I'm going to encourage you to do with every negative thought that goes through your mind. Become aware of it and then dismiss it. One of the easiest ways to dismiss a negative thought is just flip it. If you start saying something negative about yourself and start saying something positive about yourself. If you start saying something negative about something in the world, then say something that you're grateful for in the world. Just find a way to flip it. The 5th law is the law of insertion. And that means that you can insert a thought of any type, of any kind into your mind. No one opens up your little cranium and decides what you're going to think about today. That's all under your control. You control whatever you want to think about. So you can insert a thought of any type into your mind. And you know what the beauty of this law is that your mind doesn't know the difference between fantasy and reality. Now, I've had a couple people push back to me on this, but I have to remind them, I didn't write the laws, I'm just the messenger. But think about the last time you were in your living room, for example, watching a movie that you really got into. And so you were really following the story. You felt like you were there. Well, let me remind you, you were probably sitting in your living room, maybe eating some popcorn. Maybe you had a fire going. Maybe it was snowing outside. Maybe it was raining. But you really weren't aware of any of that because your mind didn't care. It was focused on the story. And then the sixth law is the law of connection. And that means we live in two worlds simultaneously. We live in a physical world where there's situations, circumstances, people, places, and things. And then there's an internal world where our thoughts, our feelings, and our beliefs exist. And those two worlds are absolutely interconnected. And if you're spending all of your time reacting to everything in your physical world, that's how you're creating reality. And chances are you're probably not that happy. And so in order to stop reacting to everything in your physical world, try to become conscious of what you want to see in your physical world. So I always tell people, think about getting in shape. It's the easiest metaphor. You wake up one day, you look in the mirror and you say, oh, I'm looking a little lethargic. I'm not moving too well. I've put on a few extra pounds, whatever. But the first place that you have to go before you open the door to the gym to go work out is you've got to start in your mind and say, okay, my new reality is I'm going to get in shape. And from that point forward, that's how the journey begins. And it begins that way for all of us. Now, I told you that there were 6 universal laws plus 1. Well, here's the plus 1. The plus 1 is very specific to you, to me, to every single person on this planet. And it's all based on the same foundation. It all happens for us from the exact same place. And that place is called our beliefs. And so whatever you believe about yourself becomes your universal law. So if you believe you can do something, you can do it. And if you believe you can't do something, you believe you can't do something. But there really isn't any evidence to support it either way. But you've made it a universal law, so now it's what you follow. So I got to remind you again, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And that is your universal laws. So really think about what I've just taught you. Because if you find yourself being a really negative person, you've chosen that path. And you can just as easy choose the positive one. You can choose the happy path, or you can choose the sad path. And I got news for you. There's other paths that we've taken on that we don't necessarily want to almost admit to. But it actually can do with our health, our disposition, and our well-being. So if this resonates for you and you'd like to explore it a little bit further, give me a call. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. I'm Dr. John Beiter.